The late 1980s were a defining period for role playing games as developers sought to expand their depth, complexity, and storytelling. Few series embodied this evolution better than Dragon Warrior, a franchise that helped lay the foundation for console RPGs as we know them today. Released in 1987, Dragon Warrior 2 built upon the success of its predecessor, introducing party based combat, a larger world, and deeper mechanics, pushing the genre forward in bold new ways. But its impact wasn't just about one game. It was part of a trilogy that, within 2 years, established Dragon Warrior as a cultural phenomenon in Japan. Though its journey to North America took longer, its influence on the RPG genre remains undeniable. Today, in celebration of the anniversary of Dragon Warrior 2, we're not just revisiting its legacy, we're diving into the full story of the original Dragon Warrior trilogy. From its development and impact to its lasting influence on the genre, we'll explore how these games shaped the future of RPGs. So gather your party, prepare your spells, and join us for today's legendary trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 231st episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are piggybacking off the anniversary of Dragon Warrior 2 to revisit the entire Dragon Warrior trilogy, the first trilogy in the Dragon Warrior series. Dragon Warrior 2, as a sequel to a beloved original game, added to it. It introduced party based gameplay, a larger world, and more complex storytelling, which was certainly an evolution in role playing games at the time. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co host, who probably has his own strategies for tackling retro RPG challenges. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, if you could recruit a party member for a role playing adventure from any game to help you on a quest, who would you bring along?
Damn. You think that'd be an easy question to answer?
Yeah, I know. There's so many good choices or bad choices. Like, would it be fun to take Mario with you? Would you take someone that like Master Chief?
Matt, it's funny that you mentioned Master Chief because that was one I was thinking of, and I was
Yep.
like, he'd be a pretty badass person to be along to help. But then I was thinking, like, who uses magic and can basically just make anything that I want? And with
My
that,
who is it?
someone like Loki or something.
Oh, I was gonna say my character in Hogwarts Legacy.
Oh, that's another good one. There you go.
I think my answer would be, for whatever reason, Lara Croft was on the top of
Interesting.
my head because not only is she a badass, I mean, in especially in the modern Tomb Raider series, she has been beat down, knocked, tossed around, near dead time after time after time. So she is the ultimate badass. She also is an incredible historian and an incredible puzzle solver, and I think that's a fantastic blend of traits to have when you're trying to, you know, have an adventure with someone. So,
That's very fair. I can respect that. It's a good answer.
because she is a badass. Master Chief,
Indeed.
though, good one.
Oh yeah, that's definitely
So today we are going to, we're our topic today is Dragon Warrior 2, but it's been a long time since we looked at the original Dragon Warrior, so we're gonna go into it. And the original three is a trilogy, so I thought it more appropriate to kind of look at the entire Dragon Warrior trilogy, two, one, two, and three, since they're all one story. So that's going to be our focus today. Little bit of a change up. But before we get back to Dragon Warrior's story, why don't you tell our listeners what else has happened during the current week in gaming history?
Kicking it off, we have on January 29th, 1996, Duke Nukem 3D exploding onto the gaming scene, redefining the first person shooter genre with its irreverent humor and interactive environments. Developed by 3D Realms, the game followed the macho, one liner spouting Duke Nukem as he battled aliens across Los Angeles and beyond to save the world and its women. Building on the success of earlier Duke Nukem platformers, Duke Nukem 3D introduced players to a dynamic and destructible world, featuring innovative level design, a wide array of weapons, and memorable multiplayer modes. Its blend of action, humor, and interactivity made Duke Nukem 3D a cultural touchstone of the 1990s, influencing countless games and cementing its place in history. And we did an episode.
We did. You and I played Duke Nukem 3D.
Indeed. So if you want to learn more, go find it in our archives and figure out which one it is and go listen.
It's an early one.
Indeed.
Speaking of games that we've done episodes on,
Oh, indeed. On January 31, 1997, Final Fantasy VII was released in Japan for the Sony PlayStation, marking a turning point in the history of role playing games and gaming as a whole. Developed by Square, the game introduced players to the sprawling dystopian world of Midgar and the epic journey of Cloud Strife and his companions as they battled against the Shinra Corporation and the enigmatic Sephiroth. Renowned for its cinematic storytelling, iconic characters, and groundbreaking use of 3D graphics, Final Fantasy VII set a new standard for the genre, reaching audiences far beyond traditional JRPG fans. Its success solidified the PlayStation as a dominant platform and showcased the potential of video games as a narrative medium. For a deep dive into the game's development, evolving storylines, and impact of its release, go check out episode 179 of our podcast.
yeah, buddy.
Indeed.
And we just kind of talked about this one recently.
Which one is this one?
The next one.
Ah, indeed. Next up, we have on January 27, 2000, Resident Evil Survivor was released for the PlayStation in Japan, introducing a first person perspective to Capcom's iconic survival horror series. Departing from traditional third person gameplay, Survivor featured light gun mechanics, through a feature that was removed in some regions, as players navigated a mysterious island overrun by Umbrella's bioorganic weapons. While it retained the series' emphasis on exploration and item management, Survivor was criticized for repetitive gameplay and lack of tension compared to predecessors. Despite mixed reviews, the game marked an experimental entry into the franchise, paving the way for future first person Resident Evil titles.
We talked about that in our Resident Evil 4 episode, because it was one of the games that was released in the series immediately prior to Resident Evil 4 coming out.
Yeah, that.
Yeah.
So go check that out if you want to learn more.
Yes, indeedy.
Next up, on January 29th, 2004, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green were released in Japan, bringing modern enhancements to the beloved first generation Pokemon games. Developed by Game Freak for the Game Boy Advance, these remakes of Pokemon Red and Green revitalized the Kanto region with updated graphics, new gameplay mechanics, and expanded features. They introduced wireless communication through the GBA wireless adapter, allowing players to trade and battle without link cables. If you don't know what link cables are, go figure that out, because that's pretty cool. Maybe we'll do an episode on one day on it. And included new content such as the Sevi Islands, extending the adventure beyond the original story. Fire Red, Leaf Green were praised for their balance of nostalgia and innovation, solidifying their place as standout entries in the Pokemon franchise. And if you want to learn more about the games that inspired Fire Red and Leaf Green, the old school Pokemon, we did an episode on that.
We did, yes,
So go find it and learn about the Pikachu Jet.
And also that includes the link cable, because the link cable is part of the original design of the series.
Yeah, see, it's almost like I was telling you the whole time to go check it out.
Wow.
And last up for this week in gaming history, on January 31st, 2008, Super Smash Bros. Brawl debuted in Japan for the Nintendo Wii, delivering the largest and most ambitious entry in the franchise to date. Featured an expansive roster that included newcomers like Meta Knight, Solid Snake, and Sonic the Hedgehog, Brawl brought together beloved characters from across gaming history. The game introduced cinematic story mode, the Subspace Emissary, which blended platforming with epic battles, and offered online multiplayer for the first time in the series. Praised for rich content, vibrant stages, and chaotic fun, Brawl became a cornerstone of party and competitive gaming, further solidifying the Smash Bros. Series as a cultural phenomenon. And to learn more about the beginning of the series, go check out one of our episodes where I did that with a few friends and Dave.
That was real early. Whew,
Yeah, it was. Whew.
that was real
But it was fun,
early.
so go check it out.
Rob, it's been a long while since we last talked about Dragon Warrior. In fact, it's been 88 weeks. I looked
Wow.
it up. So, in case you've forgotten about it or just joining us, I thought that we could talk again briefly about where Dragon Warrior comes from and how it kind of gives way into Dragon Warrior 2, which is on its anniversary today, this week rather, and then into Dragon Warrior 3. And there's a reason why we're going to talk about all of them, which we'll kind of get to the end. But in it all started in 1982 when the developer of the game Enix, before it merged with Square, you know it nowadays as Square Enix, but once upon a time Square and Enix were two separate companies. So Enix hosted a competition. That competition was called the Enix Hobby Program Contest. And it was a programming contest, basically. They placed ads in both computer and manga. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes! Yes. They placed ads in computer and manga magazines offering a prize of 1 million yen if they could offer up a game prototype that Enix could publish. So basically, it said, send us in your game, and if we like it, we'll pay you 1 million yen, which is about $10,000 if I remember correctly.
That's pretty good. Pretty good.
Many people submitted entries, and there were a number of winners. There were a number of contests too. They ran the contest more than once. One of the winners, initially, the first winner, if I'm not mistaken, was Yuji Horii. And Yuji Horii was, at the time, working as a writer for a well known manga that was titled The Weekly Shonen Jump. Winner of one of the later contests was a man named Koichi Nakamura. He submitted a puzzle game called Door Door. Yuji Horii, if I remember correctly, it was a tennis game called like Love Tennis or something along those lines. But winning the contest basically convinced Horii to become a video game designer and essentially start bringing the ideas he had for games to life. And among these ideas that came to him was one that he thought of while he was reading a PC Magazine article about the rise of text adventure games in the United States. And Horii recognized that the Japanese market was severely lacking in adventure titles. We've talked a lot about old school adventure games in the United States. In the early, I guess you could say, history of gaming, it was dominated by text adventures, by adventure games, period, from Colossal Cave Adventure to Zork to Mystery House into the King's Quest series. We had all of them, but there wasn't really the same market for them over in Japan. And so he decided to take what he knew about these Western text adventures and expand on them with his own ideas. And this resulted in an incredibly influential game called the Portopia Serial Murder Case. Now, various Japanese game designers have cited this game as their inspiration for getting into game design. We've talked about it in various episodes before. When we covered Metal Gear and its designer Hideo Kojima, Kojima directly cited Portopia as his inspiration for getting into game design, period. So when Portopia became a smashing success, they started porting it over to other platforms. And when it came time to bring the game over to the Nintendo Famicom, they turned to a company, Enix, turned to a company called Chunsoft to work on the port. Now, Chunsoft was founded not by Horii, but that other contest winner, the one who did Door Door, Koichi Nakamura. And so It brought Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura together for the first time as they were porting Portopia Serial Murder Mystery to the Nintendo Famicom. And while they're working on this project, they're playing a Western RPG that was popular at the time called Wizardry. And we did an entire episode on Wizardry. I would encourage you to go listen to it if you'd like to learn more. I always say that there are, 3 games that are the granddaddies of the role playing genre, and Wizardry is one of them. If you'd like to learn the others, go check out the episode.
Yeah.
So they're playing Wizardry and they're having a great time with it. And so the idea gets floated to create their own role playing game. One in particular that was going to combine elements of Wizardry and another game that was popular amongst games in the group that was called Ultima, which may or may not be one of the others.
Wow.
More importantly, just like Horii wanted to bring his own ideas to the genre, as he did when he brought the text adventures over and created Portopia, they wanted to bring their own ideas over to role playing and create their own role playing game that was going to introduce the concept of Western RPGs to Japanese video game audiences. They didn't have those, D&D was very much a Western RPG thing. It did not exist in Japanese culture. And they wanted to take that concept and they wanted to expand on it. And so one of their ideas initially, as they began to kind of plan this out, was actually inspired by the success of all things, completely different genre, Super Mario Brothers. And what they realized was that in order to be successful, they had to simplify role playing games to make them accessible to a larger audience in the same way that Mario simplified platform games while expanding on the idea with power ups and so on and so forth to the platform genre. And so their idea basically started by taking tabletop gameplay, Dungeons and Dragons tabletop gameplay, and creating a new kind of role playing game that did not require any previous knowledge, didn't require hours of experience, a game that could literally just be picked up by anyone, right? So Horii sits down and he basically creates the design for the entire game, the story, and a rough idea of what all the enemies would be. And then he takes all of his work and he hands us his ideas to someone that he had met through his work at Weekly Shonen Jump, which just so happened to be a very well known manga artist named Akira Toriyama. And Akira Toriyama, that name might be a little familiar. He is the man who created the Dragon Ball series. Really popular now? Only so at the time. Well, dead now, unfortunately. It's a dark too
Him,
soon.
yeah, but not the show. I mean, damn.
No, Dragon Ball's still there. We lost Toriyama in 2023? I think it was 2023, wasn't it? We lost him recently, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
that sounds right.
I don't think it
I don't
was
think it was
last
last
year.
year.
Yeah, I think it was the year before. So Toriyama was asked to illustrate the characters and the monsters to help. Basically, they wanted the game to stand out. There were other role playing games in the Japanese market that they would be competing with, and they felt that by asking such an excellent artist as Toriyama that they would be able to create art that would allow them to stand out amongst all the RPGs. So Horii designs the game. Toriyama basically, does the art, and they find a pretty well known composer from TV and movies, popular TV and movies over there to help them with the music. And Nakamura, the Chunsoft guy, ends up directing the title. And so the team does their whole thing. They put together all the pieces, and they end up developing and releasing what is the first game in the Dragon Warrior series on May 27th, 1986. And initially, admittedly, things don't look so good. In fact, initial sales of the game were so incredibly low that it looked like Enix was actually going to lose money on the game. But what the team did is Yuji Horii and Toriyama, they leveraged their still working relationship with the manga Shonen Jump, and the publication starts to write positive articles on the game. And as these articles are released, sales of Dragon Warrior just kind of jump up substantially. As a result, in the first 6 months, it sells over 1 million copies in Japan. Not bad for a 1986 title. And it took 3 years, and we're going to return to this shortly, but it took 3 years before it was released to North American audiences. And for whatever reason, it flopped when it was released over here, too. There was just something about this game, despite all their best efforts, that when it first came over here, and was released there, it didn't resonate with audiences from the get go initially. In fact, fun little side story: Nintendo actually had a like large inventory of this game sitting around by the when it was released for North America, and no one was buying it. And so what they did is they ended up making it available for free for Nintendo Power subscribers. And at the time, if you were to go to your local store and buy the game was about $50, but subscriptions to the magazine were only about $20. So it ended up being an incredibly popular promotion that ended up bringing about 500,000 new subscribers to the magazine. And if you resubscribed with the magazine, you could get it too. So it convinced many, many, many others to renew their subscriptions.
That's pretty smart.
Isn't it?
Like, damn.
Right? Right? And so that's kind of how it got its headway over here in the United States. Inevitably, this series saw success in North America too, but it probably took the better part of a decade for it to just get its footing and take off. And yeah, well, like I said, we'll revisit that concept as we look at Dragon Warrior 2 and 3. There were plans for a second game in the Dragon Warrior series before they even knew that the first was remotely going to be successful. About a month before they released Dragon Quest in April of 86, they released the game in May, so we're talking a month before. They had already begun laying the groundwork for a second game in the series, all right? Dragon Quest releases in May, and by July, the team already has their memory map and their story idea. It's all kind of planned out. So in July, they're able to start development on the second game in the Dragon Warrior / Dragon Quest series. I'm gonna mix them up at this point because I mixed them up while I was writing. Uh, Dragon Warrior is its Japanese release. When they went to release it stateside, there was a pen and paper game named Dragon Quest, so they couldn't call it Dragon Quest over here. So to North American audiences, it is Dragon Warrior. It has been Dragon Warrior to me for so long. It is really hard for me or has been Dragon Quest to me for so long. It's really hard of me to think of as Dragon Warrior. I know I'm going to
Clearly
flip flop.
not, because you just flip flopped.
I know. I'm sorry, guys. I know I'm going to continue to flip flop. I am so sorry. So yeah, so like I said, a month before they released Dragon Warrior, they're already laying the groundwork for the second one. By the time they release it within a month, they've kind of already had the map for Dragon Warrior 2, and so they get started on development. Now, right from the beginning of the planning process, they split the development team. It's the same development team. They split them up into two groups. One that was going to be working on the story and the monsters, the story group, and the other was going to work on gameplay and programming. And everyone's roles pretty much stayed the same. Yuji Horii wrote the story, Toriyama does the artwork, Nakamura directs the game and programs it, and that composer Koichi Sugiyama composes the music again. Pretty much everyone is back at it. The team's all back together. There is a little bit of expansion. They do have more employees now, but the core group stayed the same. In the planning stage, the team expresses the belief that Dragon Quest's one-on-one combat was tedious. It's one of the things that they didn't like as they got towards the end of the first one. It was too late to change it. It was too tedious, it was too simple. And when you combined the tedious aspect and the simplicity, it just made the leveling system boring, they felt. Now, remember, they were initially inspired to make Dragon Warrior because they were all having fun plazing. They were all having fun plazing because they were all having fun playing wizardry. And wizardry, players controlled parties of up to 6 players. So for this title, as they're expanding on the first title in the series, they wanted to do something similar. However, like Dragon Warrior, they were still developing on the Nintendo Famicom, and the Nintendo Famicom did not have the robust specifications that a personal computer had, what they were playing wizardry on. And so they had to work around the technical limitations of the Nintendo Famicom. As far as the party was concerned, this resulted in the fact that they were only able to build parties of only 3 players. Because essentially, technically, the Famicom could handle 8 sprites, 8 layers, so 2. So basically, you had a player was 2, 2 players was 2, 3 players was 2, 1, 2, 3, and then if they were talking to one NPC, that was your 4. So that's how they designed it. You'd have a party of 3 talking to an NPC. So that was how they worked around. That's why they decided on a party of 3. That's why they decided on a party of 3. And it's kind of funny because that concept stuck around for a long, long time, and it really started here, like parties of 3 in role playing games.
Right.
That's just been a concept forever, and it's really just a technical limitation.
That's pretty funny. Never knew that.
So Yuji Horii wanted parties, but he also was working on the assumption that there would be many new players to the Dragon Warrior series, players that had not played the first Dragon Warrior game, right? So he decided that he was going to kind of introduce this concept, this multi-party concept, not by dumping players in to the parties that they kind of already established in the story, because this is a continuation of the first one, but instead, players in this game, you kind of have to search for your new party members. So they kind of built an introduction of sorts into the game. And as they're working through programming this game, they're taking their experience from the first title and they're basically improving on every single aspect of it. There's every bit of this game is technologically superior to the first. Many of the employees that they hired in, though, were students. They were able to hire a bunch of programming students, and Nakamura, he really wasn't used to working with a team. So he didn't have a concept on how to delegate work. He didn't really have a concept on how to communicate goals. And when you couple this up with the fact that you're working with students, students are just learning how to program. They don't really understand the organizational part of it, right? There's no one noting their lines, so they didn't know who coded what. There is no one, well, actually, that's pretty much it. When you don't know who's doing what and it comes time to debug, you don't know who to talk to about what works how. And so, as they're debugging it and working through the code and learning everything, because they don't have any rhyme or reason to it, Nakamura basically has to walk through that whole process by himself. And that substantially delayed this game. You know, while programming, they kind of start the process with the maps, then they worked on the characters, then they program the items into the game, and then lastly, they program the monster data and they're digitizing the artwork into the game. And that brings us to the other group. That was the programming group, but we also have the story group. Well, the monsters were programmed last by the programming team. That was actually the starting point for the story group. They started with the monsters' names and their skills and their personalities, and all of that was decided first, and then everything was handed over to their artist, Toriyama. And what Toriyama did is he painted full paintings of the characters because that's what he was accustomed to as a manga. Why did
Manga.
manga? Good lord, because that's what he was accustomed to as a manga artist, as painting full size drawings. So He painted full size drawings. He was not familiar with computer graphics. So the concept was I'm going to paint it the way I know how to paint it, and I'm going to hand it over to these programmers who will take what I've done and convert it down into pixel art, which is how they work the process. Yuji Horii has stated that as they work through this process, he always had an outline of the story's plot in his mind. And so blank maps were created to create the physical shape of an area, such as a castle or a cave. And then they put the key elements and the story into that physical area. Now, at the beginning of development, Nakamura, as director, was asked by the producer, who we haven't really talked about, but he was asked for a definite release date, and they gave the release date in the beginning as roughly November. That was the development time that they thought that they needed. But as the team was wrapping up development, and the debugging was taking longer, then they're playtesting the game, and they found that the game was too difficult. And so in November, it was announced that the game would be released in late December. So we have a delay. While designing Dragon Warrior 2, Nakamura had written a program that simulated every single combat, right? And he then used that program to adjust the game's setting for leveling. So this is his balance alongside the strength of the enemies they would encounter. So he can simulate combat, and that basically tells him, hey. And if you remember the way that Dragon Warrior was designed, it's leveled by areas, right? Enemy enemies are, you cross over a bridge and suddenly you're in level 30 enemies versus level 20 on the other side of the bridge. And that was kind of how these guys designed their games. What Nakamura's program didn't do was it failed to account for larger monster groups. So as the game got further in, the enemies got harder, but the groups got larger, and he never accounted for the more enemies, and so it turned the difficulty spike way, way, way up there. Not only that, but one of the draws of this game is a boat. There is a boat that you can use to sail around, and that boat could be used to skip areas. And so players were playtesting and they used the boat to skip areas, and then they'd find themselves in a level 20 levels higher than where they are, and they'd just get their butts whooped. You know what I mean?
All right.
So they had balance issues, and they worked on that. They made some changes to the design of the map to make the game a little more accessible to all players. And in the process, they unfortunately slipped past also that late December release, and rather they landed on a late December date in terms of finishing the project. And so they put all the pieces together, and Dragon Warrior 2 was finally released in Japan on January 26th, 1987. Rob, hearing about the challenges and innovation that went into creating Dragon Warrior 2, from balancing difficulty to pioneering RPG mechanics, it really reminds me about how much effort goes into crafting something meaningful.
Absolutely. And with all the trial and error they went through, it's amazing they pulled it off. It's kind of like starting your own project, like a podcast, where you're constantly learning and refining as you go.
Exactly. And if you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, Zencaster makes the whole process so much easier. It's like the perfect tool to turn your ideas into reality.
Zencaster? What makes it so special?
Well, Zencaster is an all in one podcasting platform that lets you record high quality audio and video right from your web browser. No complicated setups, no fancy equipment. Just log in, hit record, and you're good to go.
That part sounds simple, but what about editing? That's always the tricky part.
Well, Zencaster has you covered there. Their post production tools automatically clean up your audio by removing background noise, balancing levels, and even cutting out awkward pauses or filler words like or ah. It's like having a professional editor on your team.
Okay, but once I've got podcast ready, how do I share it?
Well, that's simple. Absolutely the best part about Zencaster, it makes distribution a breeze. You can send your podcast straight to platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more, all from the Zencaster platform. Zencaster is absolutely the easiest way to get your voice out there.
All right, I'm sold. But how can our listeners get started?
Well, that's simple. Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. Whether you're starting your very first podcast or looking to level up your current one, Zencaster has all the tools you need to sound like a pro.
Well, that's a great deal. Listeners, if you've ever wanted to share your passion, whether it's games, stories, or anything else, Zencaster can help you make it happen.
Absolutely. Again, head to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code memory card lane, and you can start your podcasting journey today.
All right, let's get back to the fascinating story behind Dragon Warrior 2.
So when Dragon Quest II was released in Japan, it sold 500,000 copies in its first week. Not bad considering that the first one only sold that in 6 months, you know. And by the end of 1987, it had sold 2.4 million copies. So in the first year, 2.4 million copies, that's an incredibly successful release. And you remember, it took some time for Dragon Quest, or as we know it over here, Dragon Warrior, to be localized and brought over. Dragon Warrior wasn't released for the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System, until August of 1989. And so to add to everything, there were many things that the development team wanted to do with Dragon Quest II that either had to be cut out because of either memory or technical limitations of the Nintendo Famicom. And so what the team decided was that they were going to take again all their experience and ideas that they had learned and worked on along the way, and they were going to continue working on the series and make another game in the series. So all this cut content and all these ideas and tricks that they learned go into Dragon Quest 3. And Dragon Quest 3 improves on most everything from the first two games in the process. So to kind of lay it all out for you, because it is confusing, and I know I've been mixing Dragon Warrior and Dragon Quest up. They're the same game, I promise you. Dragon Quest 3 is a prequel of sorts to the first two games. It takes place in a different world, like, hundreds of years before the old one. They're all the part of the same story, but the third is the first one in the series chronologically. And the hero of the series is Erdrick, and so it's commonly called Erdrick's Trilogy, also known as the Hero's Trilogy, because sometimes he's just called the hero. But the first three games are all one and the same, and by storyline, like I said, the third is actually the first game, which is weird, isn't it?
Yeah, that's pretty weird.
It's relevant in a second, I promise. There's really not much to know about the development process of the third because it kind of ties into the second. They kind of just kept going and just took everything they couldn't fit into Dragon Quest 2 into Dragon Quest 3. The only thing that I will tell you is that by the third one, Nakamura really wasn't programming as much. He did almost all of the first game, half of the second game, and by Dragon Quest 3, he only did about 10% of the game. So as time went on, he was able to step back and be the boss, per se. So Dragon Quest III released on February 10th, 1988. So I want you to look at the timeline real quick. Dragon Quest 1, May 27th, 1986. Dragon Quest 2, January 26th, 1987. Dragon Quest 3, February 10th, 1988. So we're talking all three games in under 2 years. Roughly, just under 2 years.
That's a lot of games.
I mean, it's a pretty condensed timeline, right?
It definitely is, yeah.
So Dragon Quest III releases in February of 1988, like I said, and sold over 1 million copies on its first day.
Yeah, that's
And there's a tall tale that loves to get told about this because it was reported in the news that on the day of the release of Dragon Quest III, there were almost 300 students arrested for truancy who were caught trying to purchase the game and skipping school to do it. Dragon Quest III ended up selling about 3 million copies in its first week, just to put everything into perspective. In Japan, 3 million in Japan in a week. It pretty much broke every sales record at the time. Uh, the tale about there's a tall tale that the government basically said that you can't release Dragon Quest games during on school days. That's the famous tall tale. It was such a popular release that they made a law that said that Enix was no longer allowed to release the game on school days.
That's funny.
There was no law. However, Enix did make the decision in the best interest of everyone to release future installments of Dragon Quest on the weekends. And they continued to do so until 10. Dragon Quest 10, if I'm not mistaken,
Holy
was the
fuck.
very first game that went back to a weekday release. Fun, huh?
I didn't even know there were 10, so holy shit.
Oh,
Yeah, that is hilarious.
they're working on 14 at the moment.
That's insane.
I think 10 was it 10 or 11? 10 or 11 was an MMO too that I think 10 was an MMO and it's the only numbered Dragon Quest game that was never released here in the United States. When they made Dragon Quest into an MMO, it never got a North American release. So again, the entire trilogy of Dragon Quest gets released all within 2 years. And then over a year later, a year, again, told you we were revisiting this timeline, a year after the entire trilogy is released, it's finally localized. Because we don't get Dragon Warrior, the first game in the series over here, until August of 1989.
Jeez.
Oh, like I said, they couldn't call it Dragon Quest because there was already a pen and paper role playing game, a tabletop game that was called Dragon Quest, so they called it Dragon Warrior over here. But as an added bonus, because they had years of experience when they localized the game for English audiences, we actually have better graphics than the original release. And then every subsequent year, we got a new one. So Dragon Quest 2 was localized and released as Dragon Warrior 2 in September of 1990. The North American version of Dragon Warrior 2, it actually has a little storyline introduction that the Japanese version doesn't. So, little bonus for waiting 3 more years. And then Dragon Quest 3 was localized as Dragon Warrior 3, and it was released late in the NES lifespan in March of 1992. And if you recall, the Super Nintendo came out in 1991. So a lot of people were already kind of looking ahead by the time Dragon Warrior came out.
Wow.
Now, if you're looking to play the series, you are in luck because they are hard at work updating it for modern audiences. This past November, 2024, they released what's called an HD 2D remake of Dragon Quest III, and they are currently working on an HD 2D remake of Dragon Quest 1 and 2. It's supposed to be a single release, which has got a 2025 release date. And I know some people were confused why we got Dragon Quest 3 before 1 and 2, because technically in the story, Dragon Quest 3 is the first game in the series because it was a prequel to the first two. Make sense?
No, but carry on.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, the story is going in order. They didn't make them in order, but they're now going in order. 3 comes before 1 and 2, and then we can move forward to 4, 5, 6, then the rest are in order. So that's the only way it's out of order is that 3 should have been 0 or what, so to speak. So
Okay.
if you don't want to wait, the games have had multiple modern updates up until this point, just not an HD 2D remake. We got HD remakes. There is a Dragon Quest collection for the Switch. I looked it up on eBay. You can find it for $50. It has all Dragon Quest 1, 2, and 3 on a Switch cartridge. They do have some updated graphics, makes it readable on a modern TV. Um, so you can play the Dragon Quest series now if you don't want to wait for the remakes, which are we get sometime this year. So, and to be fair, the Dragon Quest collection is more faithful to the original format than the remakes are, because the remakes are essentially doing what like the Final Fantasy VII remake did to that series. Not really retelling the story, but bringing it into a modern art style and everything. You know what I mean?
Right, absolutely.
So, when we first talked, Rob, about the Dragon Quest series, we talked about its influence, and so I kind of want to revisit that today. Dragon Quest, the first one, was pretty much known as the first console RPG. And as so, it's easily one of the most influential role playing games of all time. It's easy to argue that Final Fantasy won out, became the more popular role playing series here in North America specifically. But what you can't argue is that Final Fantasy was literally created when that team over at Square saw the success of Dragon Quest and they wanted to take their own shot at a role playing game. And there are so many video games that have been influenced by a game in the series. Maybe not the first one. Sometimes it's Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest 3, for instance, had a class changing system. And class changing systems have been found in many other role playing games. So not necessarily just the first one, but there have been innovations throughout the series that have been inevitably adopted by other video game series. Some of which we've covered, like Mother, which is Mother 2 is Earthbound. We did that early on. We recently did Shin Megami Tensei. That has cites influence from Dragon Quest. Breath of Fire, did an episode on Breath of Fire that also has cites influence from Dragon Quest. This game has touched and reverberated throughout the entire genre and video game history as a result. And I know that this series doesn't have the same popularity over here, but Dragon Quest is an absolute cultural phenomenon in Japan. There are very few Japanese citizens that if you asked them to draw a slime would not draw the slime from Dragon Quest. It is the slime that is pretty much ingrained in Japanese culture. Despite your view on it, maybe you don't know Dragon Quest, maybe you've never played it, maybe you never have any intention of playing it whatsoever. You kind of got to give credit where credit's due because this series, starting here with this first trilogy, has inspired countless other great role playing games and countless other innovation in the genre as the years have progressed. So give credit where credit's due, and
Absolutely.
I think I think that's a good place to wrap up our little look at the Dragon Quest trilogy. Hmm?
Mm-hmm.
If you'd like to take a look at any of these games that were inspired by Dragon Quest, we have a lot of old episodes you can check out. The Final Fantasy was episode 121, Breath of Fire was episode 188. If you'd like to listen to these episodes, you can, of course, find them anywhere you get your podcasts, like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. But of course, you can also do so by finding them in the archives on our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
You can find a calendar of our upcoming episode topics. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can get access to ad-free and unedited versions of all of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we're going to tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. This week, we piggybacked off the anniversary of Dragon Warrior 2 to talk about the Dragon Warrior trilogy, including the first game, which we've covered before. While telling you each topic each week, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. One of the best parts about doing this is every week when I sit down to do research for a new episode, I learn things. I love learning new things. I'm always looking for new little tidbits that I didn't know about mine and your favorite video games. And I get super excited when I learn something new because then I get to teach all of you listeners this new stuff too. So in recognition of my favorite cycle, the teaching, learning, all of this, we like to kind of go roundtable and talk about what we've learned each week. Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I think my favorite takeaway from today has to be that when Dragon Warrior sales were slowing down, they just added it to a magazine and still got a bunch of people to pay for a game.
Absolutely.
I think that's fantastic. That just goes to show how powerful it can be when you do stuff like that. I mean, not something we really see nowadays, but still pretty damn cool and smart. It's a great job to them.
Yeah, it was one of these where like they did a feature on it and then pretty much put a strategy guide for the game in, and then they made the game available and it just took off. So people kind of by that point had everything they needed.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's me and you.
I never realized the timeline. I think that was the most fascinating thing to me because like as a kid I don't have concept, right? Cuz I would have been 86, 87, 88. I would have been what, 2, 3, 4 when these were released. Well, let's be fair. North America would have been 1990, 91, 92. So I would have been 6, 7, 8, which is why I know them because by the time they came to North America, I was kind of that age where I was into video games, right? And role playing games, this one, Final Fantasy, Wizardry, Wizards and Warriors, they were games that were bought and in the house for Nintendo. I grew up loving role playing games. This was no exception. So I had these and I remember them, and I just remember them being hard and not liking them. That's what I remember about them more than anything.
Nice.
But you don't have any concept of timelines when you're that age, and it's also that many years ago, right? I mean, we're almost going on 40 years for these puppies, and so I never realized one that we got 1, 2, and 3 within 2 years, and then two that it didn't even come to North America until after all those were released. And then we got 1, 2, 3 a year apart. I mean, dude, it took them longer to localize it than it took for them to make the original trilogy in Japan.
Yeah,
So,
that's crazy.
um, yeah, I don't know. I never really realized it. Also, as much as I remember playing these, I never played them. I didn't pick up the series again till like PlayStation 2 era, which would have been I think 8 or 9. I got back into the series, and so I never really realized the timeline of the games that 3 comes before 1 and 2. So uh, as a non-fan, wondering why they released a remake of 3 before 1 and 2 was kind of confusing until I realized why they did it that way.
Yeah, once you realize it, it makes it better. But yeah, I don't know, man. That's
It's the way the story
something.
goes. They released it. They're releasing it in the actual order of the story. That's all. That's all. So, all right, Rob. Well, that'll wrap it up. That's our look at Dragon Warrior. Celebrating the anniversary of Dragon Warrior 2 and talking about it. So before I take a look at next week, is there anything else you'd like to do? Add to today's episode.
Well, as always, I got to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us, and we hope you are gaining some knowledge or just enjoying listening as we do this each week. So thank you.
Absolutely. That brings us to the end of our quest through the medieval world of the Dragon Warrior series. As the pioneers of party based role playing games, they set the stage for epic adventures to come. From vast overworlds to tactical battles, the legacy of these groundbreaking games is felt in RPGs even today. So, next time you gather your allies and set forth into the unknown, remember the trailblazing heroes of the Dragon Warrior series. Next week, though, we're trading epic fantasy for relentless challenge as we delve into the dark world of Demon's Souls. Released in 2009, this pioneering title introduced the hallmarks of the Soul series: cryptic lore, strategic combat, and punishing difficulty balanced by profound reward. Does that sum it up, Rob?
Yeah, I would say so.
Join us as we explore how Demon Souls defined the hand-holding trends of its time, carving a path through one of gaming's most influential genres. Sharpen your blade and steel your nerves for next week's harrowing trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Doobie-doo, bop, 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 doo,